Good afternoon and a warm welcome to you all. In this session, we'll be exploring language interpreting as part of telling one story. We'll highlight what it means to be an interpreter and the roles that training, ethics, boundaries, and self-care play to ensure accuracy and integrity when providing this critical service. I would like to take a few seconds and introduce all of the presenters. Lola Bandana, Director of Multi-Languages Corporation, Board Member of OCCI and the Canadian Language Industry Association. Grace Egan, Director of Language Services and Digital Strategy at Access Alliance and OCCI Board Member. And I am Peter Matahayan, General Manager at Exacta Interpreting and a board member of both OCCI and the Canadian Language Industry Association. Let's have a quick look at our agenda. Um, We'll be introducing OCCI. We'll be talking about the ethical principles of community interpreting. We'll be talking about standards, ethics, what a shared responsibility that is, and finally, stories from the field. Feel free to post any questions in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them. So we'll get started with the first slide of what is OCCI. The Ontario Council on Community Interpreting, or OCCI, is a broad stakeholder collaboration with a vision of an Ontario where everyone has equal access to public services regardless of the language they speak. What was recognized during the pandemic is that information is an essential service and that language access is the foundation of a welcoming society. It is OCCI's mission to oversee the professionalization of interpreters working in the community and public services sector in Ontario and across Canada. So let's talk about our road to professionalization. The road to professionalization of any industry consists of four critical steps. Step one is to set up training and to ensure competency. We have achieved this at OCCI through standardized post-secondary training using a three-pronged strategy. Number one, with the LITP, or the Language Interpreter Training Programs, delivered by community colleges and universities, which are available across Canada. Number two, by using PLAR, or the Prior Learning Assessment Recognition, to allow for competency learning and assessment outside of the formal education programs in order to capture experienced and established interpreters. And finally, to ensure continuous learning by way of professional development hours that are required annually. Step two would be to qualify individuals using an established accreditation system. Professional community interpreters need certification or recognition in legal, healthcare, social services, education, and private sectors across the provinces and Canada. The title of an accredited community interpreter, or ACI, is that credentials for the interpreters. The interpreters accreditation framework is well established, and so far, close to 200 interpreters have been certified with the ACI designation over the past 9 years. Step three is the creation of a national standard guide to ensure quality, transparency, and accountability. National Standards for Community Interpreting Services, or NAGCIS, was created just about 20 years ago in 2003. And as a guide to ensure, it was developed as a guide to ensure quality community interpreting services. This guide is highly regarded as the guide when it comes to community interpreting and has been used by various organizations over the world. And step four, finally, is the buy-in from the service providers using an accreditation framework. Interpretation service providers, or ISPs, are organizations that coordinate the provision of interpretation services with clients and interpreters. ISPs are responsible both to clients and their interpreters and are required to adhere to quality and service standards as defined with the NSGCIS. And this is done for ISPs by achieving certification and undergoing regular third-party audits. What's next after we achieve these four steps? Well, once we've achieved all these steps, we need legislation and we need regulation in form of champions to forward this initiative. If anyone is interested in more details, please contact us. And now Grace will provide an overview of the ethical principles of community interpreting. Thank you.
Hi, so thanks, Peter. So what we're going to do is just talk about one of the cornerstones of our accreditation framework, and that is the 8 ethical principles in the National Standard Guide. And as we go through these 8, we're just going to ask everyone in the audience to think about how these can support you in your work as interpreters, or if you're on the other side, how this would ensure that you have a good communication in a situation where you don't share a language. So taking a look first at accuracy and fidelity, this is really about honoring and preserving the meaning of the message. So just being accurate and faithful to what is being said. Next, we have confidentiality. And this is really about protecting the privacy of everyone present and the confidentiality of the information. Next, impartiality. This really just boils down to not letting any bias or preference get in the way. So we all have some unconscious biases, but we leave them at the door when we're there as the interpreter. Next, respect for persons. So even though this says respect for persons, the first thing is respecting the encounter. And then out of that, you are honoring the dignity of everyone present. Next, we have maintenance of role boundaries. So 3 important points to this one. One is protecting the professional integrity. Next, this one isn't just about the interpreters, but it's about everyone present. It's reducing the exposure of a risk or liability. And so when the interpreter is staying within their role, then everyone's risk and liability is reduced. And then lastly, and this one is definitely about the interpreters, having role boundaries is really there to help support the emotional well-being and the physical safety of the interpreter. So there are many facets to this, and it's not solely about having a defined role, but what a defined role can help to achieve. Now, accountability. So again, 3 parts to this one. So first, at the immediate level, you've got accountability to the quality of the work in the moment. Then at a slightly higher level, you've got accountability to the role of the interpreter. And then at an even higher overarching level, accountability to laws and standards that regulate or oversee the industry and the profession. Lastly, we have an ethical principle of professionalism. And this is that interpreters conduct themselves as professionals. And as we seek to professionalize and standardize the industry, this is an important one for us all to remember. And then lastly, we have continued competence. So just like other professions, your initial training is not where it ends. It keeps going. So there's ongoing education, professional development, and this is actually an ethical principle for the work of community interpreting. So that wraps it up for reviewing the ethical principles. So now I'm going to hand it over to Lola to take it from here.
Thank you so much, Grace. And thank you for the organizers of this incredible program, LAD23. I know it's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes to put something like this together. One of the milestones that we had in Canada has been the national standards. Both Peter and Grace have referred to it. And when we created the national standards years ago, one of the things that we were finding when we were doing our research of the multiple standards out there was that most code of ethics and standards in this sector were for interpreters only. And what we thought is, this is a shared responsibility. It is not on the shoulders of interpreters. The quality of interpretation resides in a lot more than the interpreter. And why? Clients, you can see here, all the parties, the clients have different levels of responsibilities beyond providing an address and a time for a meeting. The client has the responsibility to let the ISP and the interpreter know of any potential risks that are out there, of providing information about the encounter so the interpreter can, prepare and research, of following the code of ethics. And one example is that we have used, multiple stories in the interpreting, arena is when the client expects the interpreter to hold the baby, or expects the interpreter to fill out forms with the client or the patient without the service provider. So those are absolutely outside of those role boundaries that we are speaking, and it's extremely important that the client educate themselves and basically do their part. Also, the ISPs. Peter mentioned ISPs is interpreting service providers. This could be private sector organization, could be non-for-profit ISP, or could be a department within an institution. So the ISP has responsibilities towards the clients and towards the interpreters as well. To the client, book and hire the best qualified people out there, the best qualified interpreters. And why? If there is a language of lesser diffusion where you do not have the necessary qualification, the responsibility is to disclose that information and say, for so and so language, we don't have someone who has the criteria as established in the national standards or what is required depending on where are you located. I understand there are people from outside of Canada here. So whatever the standards are, very important to disclose that information, to brief the client about how to effectively work with interpreters. This is also essential because the clients, they are experts at what they do. They are not experts at language. So it is important that some of us, either the ISP, the interpreter, educates the client about it, right? And also following up with the agreements. What are those agreements that you have with the client? In terms of the responsibility of the ISPs to the interpreter is, of course, first and foremost, provide detailed information about the assignment so the interpreter can prepare for it or can accept or not, right? If the interpreter is prepared to do that. Look at the working conditions. What are those working conditions for that particular assignment, or what can the ISP do about it, if anything? Pay and on time, of course, or according to the agreement, have an agreement with the interpreter. And last but not least, the interpreters. The interpreters have responsibilities again towards the clients, towards the ISPs. The ISPs could be their clients. And it goes to the code of ethics. It goes related to what Grace was saying about limitation of practice. Are you able, as an interpreter, to do the work to the highest level of competency? Can you, render that information with full accuracy? That is very important for an interpreter to know before accepting an assignment, right? Participate in professional development activities. That is essential because you need to keep up with whatever is going on. Ask information about the assignment. You want to be curious. Those are part of responsibilities the interpreter has in case the client or the ISP do not provide the information to you, right? Comply with your schedule. If you accept an assignment, and this is a big topic of discussion, and it has been in Ontario, and it happened that you like another assignment that comes later on that you like it better, is closer to home, or it has more hours. Part of the code of ethics is you stick to your original commitment unless it's a real emergency. And I would add that one that is also on the standards, but we should have more details on this. One of the responsibilities of the interpreters is towards themselves. How do I take care, if I'm an interpreter, how do I take care of myself emotionally, physically, professionally? That is also responsibility. So as you could see, this is the whole professionalization and the whole quality of interpretation relies on that collaboration. It's not one person or one organization will have the final say. All of us together are the ones who need to move this forward. And in order to give an example of how this works, we have selected some stories. Peter, Grace, and myself will share some examples that shows in challenging times or some specific circumstances how important it is that we do have a code of ethics, that we follow the national standards, and that we work with professional interpreters. And the first case is the one that I'll share. So we had some years ago, there was, a medical encounter. The doctor tells the parents of a child, this is a pediatric encounter, the doctor tells the parents that there is nothing else that can be done for this child. Basically, the child is going to die. Obviously, no one knows when, but that is the prognostic that the doctors are telling the parents. At that moment, the mother has an emotional breakdown. She starts screaming and she starts saying that she's going to kill herself. During this interaction, we have a professional interpreter working there. As this encounter develops, the clinic that is, seeing this child decides that the mother cannot be just sent home. Someone has to take care of this mother. And they send the mother to a hospital nearby. Now they ask the interpreter to go with the mother because the mother doesn't speak English. So the interpreter goes, and you are already thinking and seeing so many things that are or could go wrong in this scenario. One of the first one. After this assignment is done, the interpreter calls us and says, I don't want to ever work on a pediatric encounter. This interpreter had kids at the time and similar ages. So we can see how even a professional interpreter is having a very strong emotional response to this situation. Imagine how would that be if this was a volunteer or a family member, right? Because it's a very intense emotional situation. This has, of course, an impact not only in the emotional response of the interpreter, but also in the financial piece, because it's limiting the number of assignments, is reducing the amount of money that this person can make. The other thing is the debrief. In these cases, a debrief is extremely important, and Grace will share a little bit more on that. And that's what, we know that interpreters end up having, vicarious trauma, secondary trauma from living these experiences with the patients, with the people at court that have, intense emotional situations. And of course, it creates that ethical dilemma for the interpreter. Can I share this information with someone? Like, who else can I share? Confidentiality piece, right? So as you can see, and I'm not going to go in detail, but we can argue that in one of these cases, all of the ethical principles can be at stake, right? And the importance of proper training. So, what can we learn from this? How can we make sure that the training, we continue to train so we can protect interpreters from having to deal with similar situations? In this case, logistically, which is probably the least important in this case, but still to consider, our client was not the hospital where the mother went. Our client was this other clinic. And the interpreter was booked to do one assignment and ended up doing two and even extending the time. So these are all those little dilemmas and little things that happen that a professional interpreter needs to be prepared to work with. And now we have another story from Peter, who is going to share from his experience. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lola. Yeah, so one of the situations that we continue to come up against is family members or friends providing interpreting services. The main issue is that inaccurate interpretation will have serious consequences. Friend and family interpreters are not trained professionals, and there's a good chance that they're not fluent in all of the legal, medical, or technical terminology that may be required. They also may not be aware of the professional and ethical responsibilities of being a trained interpreter. There are many examples of strained relationships as some family members, especially when children are used, they may not be able to communicate critical personal information and end up adding their own opinions or withholding crucial parts of the message that needs to be conveyed. Due to the power dynamics and personal and emotional ties that exist or could develop, it is best to have an unbiased or impartial interpreter that will be sure to communicate without personal or emotional attachments. During training, it is emphasized that interpreters do not socialize with clients and their relatives before, during, or after assignments to ensure neutrality and avoid conflict of interest. For example, at an in-home appointment, an interpreter can be invited to a coffee or a tea before or after the appointment by the client. But the code requires to politely decline the invitation and remember that your presence as an interpreter is there to facilitate communication and to provide interpreting services and not socializing. So this is something that we continue to train the interpreters with, because this is something that happens on a regular basis, especially when it comes to community interpreting situations. And I'll ask Grace now to provide one of her stories. Thank you.
Hi. So as Lola was mentioning the debrief opportunity, it is really important that interpreters find opportunities to share in a way that protects the confidentiality of the information from the encounter, but to share with other interpreters about emotionally challenging encounters that they had or just tested their ethics. And so we recently asked one of the leaders of one of our debrief programs to give us an example to share with you. And it has come up, so I'll just read this to you. At an interpretation for palliative care, you as the interpreter realize that the patient and the family completely misunderstand, and then in quotes, will be taken care of with treatment. The family are relieved that the patient is now under medical care and will receive treatment. What is your role as the interpreter? So there was a scenario where an interpreter encountered this and they brought it to the debrief to unpack. Now, where our ethical principles can really help us in this framework is we know that it's outside the role of the interpreter to check in for comprehension or to make an assumption about whether someone has understood something or not. So how do you deal with the almost cognitive dissonance of thinking that something is off the rails here, but I can't do anything about it? So, because you don't want to leave thinking that something went wrong and then deal with that afterwards. So again, looking back at the ethical principles, it's outside the role boundaries to check in for comprehension. It's also, we need to maintain the dignity of everyone present. So we can't be making assumptions about their understanding or their intentions when we look at respect for persons. But we do know that the interpreter has two ethical principles that apply here: accuracy and fidelity, and accountability for their work. So where can they own this moment? And so one, they are accountable to the message. So in that interpreter's work, is there the possibility that they were not, that their rendering was maybe not faithful to the meaning of will be taken care of with treatment? Also, if they're accountable for their work, which points to the accountability, can they own something about the moment that points to the quality of their work? So there is room in this moment for the interpreter to ask for an interruption and ask for an explanation that they can then interpret for will be taken care of with treatment. Because if the interpreter believes that there was some ambiguity that they needed the provider to clarify, that is within their role. So the interpreter has to take a moment like that, look at themselves and their contribution to the encounter. Where can they find some strength or some guidance from the ethical principles, and then go from there? So this is all work that our accreditation framework helps to support, programs like debriefs, and just interpreters being part of a professional body so that they can learn from each other. So with that, I'm just going to share our final slide. And then just point us to what we're considering to be call to action and what we're hoping to inspire in everyone watching today. So looking at the standards, the training, the ethical principles, we really hope consumers of interpreting services some credentials as established by the National Standard Guide for Community Interpreting Services. We are hoping that all interpreters will seek to be accredited. So whether it's a framework and an organization like OCC, or if there are other local in their regions, that's what we are aiming for. And then also we are looking for the agencies hiring interpreters to aim to always contract with professional, qualified, and trained interpreters. So with that, that is our closing. And on behalf of the team at OCCI, thank you so much for the opportunity to share. Thank you to the interpreters who are supporting our message today to reach more audiences. And
do we have any questions? I don't see anything in the chat, but if we have any questions, we'll have a couple of minutes. We'll be happy to answer them. Okay, it seems we have no questions. So thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
thank you.
Thank you to all of our partners in advocacy for sharing their stories. You are the reason that efforts such as Language Advocacy Day are possible. Next on our advocacy segment, we'll be sharing the stories on language access and the Sustainable Development Goals, No Language Left Behind, presented by the Language Access Coalition of Canada and SDG Cities.
Sustainable Development Goals and Language Justice. In 2020, the United Nations extended the targeted completion date for Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, by 2030. SDGs, 17 interlinked global goals guiding local and international efforts of 191 UN member states, Canada included, are meant to address a range of issues, from environmental, health, and gender equality to education and poverty. The UN defines SDGs as a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and into the future. Their aim is to put the most vulnerable populations front and center, and this implies multilingual access. Yet, when it comes to the explicit commitment to language justice, the SDGs remain silent. Between 2017 to 2020, the topic of the absence of language access was on the agenda of symposiums and UN working groups, particularly the CONGO, the NGO Committee on Language and Languages. In May 2022, the Multilingualism and COVID-19 Symposium concluded that fully inclusive dialogue and problem solving must involve substantive use of multilingualism, particularly with respect to including linguistic minorities, so that no language is left behind. Despite the lack of UN commitment, Canadian and international organizations and initiatives are proactively exploring how to use SDGs strategically to advocate for language justice.
My name is Emily Hansen, and I work at 10C Shared Space in Guelph. I'm the SDG Cities lead here in Guelph at 10C. I've been with 10C for about a year and a half working on the SDG Cities project. 10C is a social enterprise and nonprofit located in downtown Guelph. We're all about placemaking, activating 40,000 square feet of social purpose real estate here in Guelph. That includes the Guelph Farmers Market, a commercial kitchen here at our main headquarters, co-working office space, community event space, lots of action and activities going on here at 10C when it comes to placemaking. We also do a lot of community programming, and that includes leading projects like SDG Cities, which is the main project that I work on, in collaboration with lots of partners in Guelph and Wellington County and other communities. So my work is really about creating awareness of the SDGs amongst local stakeholders, helping to gain knowledge about the SDGs and how they can work locally. We're building networks of people and organizations working towards the SDGs at the local level. And also giving people really tangible skills and experiences to be involved in local SDG action. The SDGs are really a call to action for the global community. So they were developed through global consultation that involved communities, organizations, and individuals across all sectors. So they really represent a vision for the future that we can all sort of understand and resonate with. So I think that working towards the SDGs from a local perspective, which is primarily how I work, is really important because we know that achieving the SDGs, which are these kind of really high-level, lofty goals for a sustainable future, aren't possible if local actors aren't really deeply engaged. In Canada, we have a national strategy for achieving the SDGs, and even the Canadian government really recognizes that achieving the SDGs at a national level isn't possible if local communities and organizations and individuals aren't engaged in that SDG work. But I think more broadly, I see a connection between language rights and language access and the SDGs across all 17 of the SDGs. And we also know that one of the kind of core principles of the SDGs is to leave no one behind. And that's all about recognizing that our progress towards sustainable development can't actually happen if people are excluded. So I think recognizing language and communication barriers as a real challenge in moving towards our shared goals and our vision for the SDGs. So yeah, I encourage people to visit our website, sdgcities.ca. There's lots of information, lots of virtual events, the SDG Cities Academy, all that information is there. And I would say there's lots of ways to get involved in the SDGs. And yeah, we want to be a resource for people in Ontario and across Canada who are looking to do that learning and to engage in this work.
Follow us on Twitter at LAD_Canada and subscribe to the Language Access Coalition of Canada monthly newsletter and keep advocating for language rights and justice. The creation of this video is generously supported by MCIS Social Benefit Fund 2022-2023.
I hope you are all inspired after hearing those stories from amazing language advocates. Next, LACC co-founder Craig Carter-Edwards will be facilitating a breakout networking session on coalition building, which will be an opportunity to exchange ideas and learn about how to connect with other advocates to work together to create social change.
Wow. It has been an amazing day so far, and we're only at what, 2:18. As we've already seen today, language is more than just a mode of communication. It's a pass card that allows access to service. When we don't have that certain level of proficiency in English or French, we often find access limited. Worse, sometimes it becomes someone else choosing our path is for us. Kind of heard hints of this. The worst story I have come across in this journey was from an interpreter who happened to be visiting a relative at a hospital and heard a conversation in the room next door. After a minute of listening, this interpreter urgently went and knocked on the door, asking to speak with the doctor. What was happening was that the woman in the bed was asking for end-of-life care, and the son-in-law, interpreting for her, was telling the doctor she didn't want any. Language services and equitable access aren't just an immigrant thing, not exclusively a Francophone thing. Language access is absolutely a First Nations thing and unquestionably a Deaf community thing. Without equitable language services, people get left out, get left behind, get walked over, and we all suffer. The biggest challenge we face as language service advocates is getting this message across to policymakers at all levels of government. You might hear individually from the Inuit language defenders or people demanding that the constitutional rights to service in French be upheld, or Deaf community advocates trying to be heard, or. That's on top of every other issue brought to their attention, the drinking from a fire hose. It is a lot. And even with the right intent, it can be hard for busy policymakers to connect the dots and see the deeper implications and connectivity of these different parts of the language access element. So here's my question for all of you to ponder during the breakout sessions, which are just coming up. How might we all rally around core common purposes and collectively, with one voice, help policymakers and influencers understand why equitable language access matters for us all? There is LACC, there is Language Advocacy Day, there's shared communications and hashtags and all that. This very moment, our friends at Refugee 613 are holding a workshop about information for newcomers. But what, and more importantly, how do we make sure that the voices that are being heard are all connected together, so it's harder to ignore. How do we connect together between events? How do we build and maintain relationships with politicians? How do we share and craft messages together and tip the needle on a national, on a global scale? This is what we would like to discuss in the breakout sessions. There are no moderators. This is meant to be a free-flowing conversation, a test of what we can do together. The way this works, if you look at the left, and say this is left for you, toolbar on your screen, you'll see an icon that says workshop. When everyone is in the workshop lobby, our production team will randomly place everyone into a breakout room. That's when you get to throw ideas and ask hard questions and come up with some answers to be shared when we return. There's some amazing, bright minds and a heck of a ton of experience in this virtual hall. I cannot wait to see what you guys come up with. So I will see you in a virtual breakout room.
We're having some issues with the sound. So welcome back, everyone. It is now time to begin our second panel on Canadian Language Advocacy Day, the stories we tell, where we'll hear perspectives from immigrant journalists from new Canadian media. Please submit your questions for the panel